May 1945, Borneo. The thick jungle air hung heavy with moisture as 37,000 Australian soldiers prepared for what many called a pointless battle. The Great War against Japan was nearly won. American forces were closing in on the Japanese homeland itself. Atomic weapons were being prepared in secret. Yet here, on this massive island thousands of miles from Tokyo, Australia was about to launch the largest military operation in its history. This was the victory history forgot, the campaign that crushed Japan's last strongholds while the rest of the world looked away. General Douglas MacArthur had moved north. His eyes were fixed on the Philippines and the final push toward Japan. He left the Australians behind to clean up what he called the backwater. Borneo stretched across the horizon, covered in dense rainforest and swamps. Hidden in those jungles were 20,000 Japanese soldiers. They controlled the oil fields that once pumped 350,000 barrels every single day. That oil had powered Japan's war machine for years. Now, those same Japanese troops were dug into bunkers, surrounded by barbed wire and mines, ready to fight to the death. The problem seemed simple on paper. Clear out the enemy. Take back the island. But conventional wisdom painted a dark picture. Military planners looked at previous island campaigns. They studied Guadalcanal, where fighting lasted 6 months. They examined Peleliu, where 10,000 Americans fought for 2 months to take a tiny island. They calculated the dense jungle, the fortified positions, and the fanatical resistance. Their conclusion was grim. Borneo would take 12 to 18 months of brutal jungle warfare. Thousands of Australian boys would die fighting an enemy that was already beaten. Back in Australia, newspapers questioned the mission. Politicians stood in Parliament and asked why young men should die for oil fields when Japan was about to surrender anyway. American commanders quietly agreed. They saw the Australians as second-rate troops, being given a second-rate assignment. The real war was happening elsewhere. Borneo was just mopping up, a footnote to the great victory that everyone knew was coming. Why sacrifice lives for something that did not matter? Into this storm of doubt walked General Leslie Morshead. He was 55 years old, with grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Morshead was not like other generals. He had earned his reputation at Tobruk in North Africa, where he and his Australian troops held a city under siege for 8 months. The Germans had surrounded them completely. They had cut off supplies and pounded them with artillery. Everyone expected Tobruk to fall. Instead, Morshead's men earned the nickname the Rats of Tobruk because they lived underground and refused to surrender. The siege became legendary. Morshead became known as a man who thought differently, who found ways to win when others saw only defeat. But here in the Pacific, some commanders dismissed him. They said his glory days were behind him. They said Tobruk was luck, not skill. American officers whispered that the Australians were tired, that their best soldiers had already died in the desert or New Guinea. One US general wrote in a private letter that the Borneo Campaign would be a test of whether the Australians could still fight a modern war. The expectation was low. The respect was thin. Morshead studied the maps in his tent. He read intelligence reports while insects buzzed against the lantern light. He listened to his officers predict casualties. 10,000 dead, they said, maybe 15,000. For what? For oil fields that Japan could no longer use? For territory that would be returned after the war anyway? The math seemed cruel. Young lives traded for meaningless ground. But Morshead saw something everyone else missed. Deep in the intelligence files were reports from coast watchers and local resistance fighters. They spoke of prison camps hidden throughout Borneo. These were not small camps. Thousands of prisoners of war and civilians were dying in Japanese hands. Australian soldiers, British troops, Dutch civilians, local people who had helped the Allies. The numbers were staggering. In Sandakan alone, 2,000 prisoners had started a death march. Only 6 survived. The rest died of starvation, disease, or were executed when they became too weak to walk. The camps were scattered across the island. The prisoners were eating grass and insects to stay alive. Disease ravaged them: dysentery, malaria, beriberi. Their bodies were wasting away to nothing. Some weighed less than 80 pounds. The Japanese guards had standing orders. If Allied forces came close, if rescue seemed possible, the prisoners were to be killed. Every single one. Leave no witnesses. Leave no one to tell the world what had happened. Morshead looked at those reports and understood what others did not. This was not about oil. This was not about territory or strategy. This was about time. Every day that passed, more prisoners died. Every week of delay meant more mass graves in the jungle. If Australia waited for Japan to surrender, if they followed MacArthur north and left Borneo for later, those prisoners would all be dead. The Japanese would make sure of it. He called his senior officers together one humid evening. Mosquitoes swarmed outside the tent. Maps covered every surface. Morshead spoke quietly, but his words were firm. The mission was not what everyone thought. They were not here to mop up. They were not here for oil or glory. They were here for the prisoners who had days or weeks left to live. Every hour mattered. Speed was everything. This would not be a conventional campaign. There would be no slow advance through the jungle. They would strike fast, strike hard, and reach those camps before the executioners received their final orders. The other generals exchanged glances. Some nodded slowly. Others looked doubtful. Fast jungle warfare against entrenched positions? It sounded impossible, but Morshead had been impossible before. He had held Tobruk when holding it made no sense. Now he planned to liberate Borneo while the world called it pointless. The question was whether speed and surprise could overcome jungles, bunkers, and an enemy that never surrendered. Morshead spread his plan across the table like a gambler revealing his cards. He called it the oil spot strategy, though others would simply call it survival through speed. The idea was simple but dangerous. Australian forces would not march slowly through the jungle, fighting for every mile. Instead, they would strike from the sea like lightning, land on beaches, secure a strong position, then expand outward in all directions like oil spreading across water. Each new area captured would become another spot, another base. The Japanese would be surrounded, cut off from supplies, forced to choose between surrender and starvation. The plan required perfect coordination. Naval guns would pound enemy positions from the sea. Bombers would strike specific targets with surgical precision. Infantry would rush forward the moment the guns fell silent. Most importantly, local knowledge would guide every move. For months, coast watchers had lived in the jungle, hidden among friendly villages. They knew where the Japanese bunkers stood. They knew which paths through the swamps could support heavy equipment. They knew where water could be found and where disease bred. These men, many of them Australian officers who had escaped capture years before, sent detailed reports by radio. Native Dayak tribesmen risked death to draw maps and count enemy soldiers. But in Melbourne and Washington, doubt remained thick as smoke. American admirals questioned whether Australia had enough ships for such an operation. British commanders wondered if Morshead was rushing toward disaster. Even some Australian officers whispered that the general had grown too bold, that Tobruk had made him believe he could work miracles. The proposed timeline seemed fantasy. Take Tarakan Island in 3 weeks? Impossible. That small island held 2,000 Japanese defenders in concrete bunkers. Previous estimates said it would take 3 months minimum. Then Prime Minister John Curtin stepped forward. He was a thin man, worn down by years of war and worry. His health was failing. He would be dead within weeks, though few knew it then. But Curtin understood what Morshead understood. Australian prisoners were dying in camps right now, this very minute. He stood before Parliament and spoke with quiet intensity. This was not about strategy or politics. This was about bringing Australian boys home before they vanished into unmarked graves. He gave Morshead everything he asked for. Every ship, every plane, every soldier available. The first test came on May 1st, 1945. Dawn broke grey and tense over Tarakan Island. 12,000 Australian troops waited in landing craft that bobbed on dark water. The island rose before them, green and deadly. For 2 weeks, bombers had pounded Japanese positions. Naval guns had turned bunkers into rubble. Now it was time to see if speed could overcome concrete and steel. The landing craft engines roared. Spray hit the soldiers' faces as boats raced towards shore. Naval shells screamed overhead, massive sounds that made the air shake. The first Australian boots hit sand at exactly 0600 hours. Mortars immediately answered. Machine gun fire ripped across the beach. Men fell. Others pressed forward. Within minutes, the first bunkers came into view, dark openings in the earth surrounded by barbed wire. This was where Morshead's plan showed its teeth. Flamethrower tanks rolled off landing ships. These were Matilda tanks, British-made, modified with fuel tanks and nozzles that shot liquid fire 50 feet. They rumbled toward the bunkers while infantry followed close behind. When a bunker refused to surrender, fire poured through the opening. The sound was terrible, a rushing roar followed by screams. Some Japanese soldiers ran out burning. Others stayed inside and died. It was ugly work, but it was fast. Each bunker fell in minutes rather than hours. Behind the tanks, engineers worked frantically. They cleared paths through minefields using metal detectors and careful prodding. They built roads for supplies to move forward. They marked safe zones with white tape. The beachhead expanded like Morshead promised, spreading inland in all directions. By nightfall on day 1, Australian forces held positions that planners said would take a week to reach. Intelligence from local sources proved perfect. Coast watchers had marked every Japanese strongpoint on detailed maps. When Australian forces reached these coordinates, they found the bunkers exactly where the maps showed them. Dayak guides led patrols through swamps that tanks could not cross. They pointed out which water was safe to drink and which would bring fever. They warned when Japanese troops were preparing ambushes. This local knowledge saved hundreds of Australian lives. The Japanese defenders fought with expected fury. They launched counterattacks at night, screaming as they charged with bayonets fixed. Australian machine guns cut them down in the darkness. During the day, snipers in trees picked off unwary soldiers. Mortars fell randomly, killing men who thought they were safe. Every yard forward cost blood, but the yards kept coming, faster than anyone predicted. Naval support made the difference. Over 500 ships sat offshore, from massive battleships to small patrol boats. When Australian infantry radioed for help, naval guns answered within minutes. Shells the size of trash cans arced through the air and exploded with devastating accuracy. One Japanese bunker complex held out for 3 days until a battleship put 6 shells directly on target. The explosions left only craters where concrete had stood. After 1 week, Australian forces controlled half the island. After 2 weeks, Japanese resistance collapsed into isolated pockets. By day 21, Tarakan Island was secure. The final count told the story better than any speech. 225 Australians killed, 1,540 Japanese dead. The oil facilities, predicted to be destroyed in fighting, stood mostly intact. More importantly, the timeline that seemed impossible had been crushed. 3 weeks instead of 3 months. But the true victory hid in the details that few noticed. Hidden in Tarakan's jungle, Australian scouts found a small prisoner of war camp. 32 men lived there, barely alive. They had been Australian soldiers captured in Java 3 years before. They weighed an average of 90 pounds. Their ribs showed through skin. Some could barely walk. When they saw Australian uniforms, Grown men wept like children. One prisoner kept saying the same words over and over. "You came. You actually came." Morshead read the report in his command tent. He studied the photographs of the rescued prisoners, their hollow faces and skeleton bodies. Then he looked at the map of Borneo stretching before him. Tarakan was one small island. The main operation lay ahead. Brunei Bay, Balikpapan, larger targets, more Japanese defenders, and hidden throughout the jungles, dozens of camps holding thousands more prisoners. The oil spot strategy had worked once. Now it needed to work again, but faster. Time was not a luxury. It was a countdown to mass execution. The success at Tarakan opened the floodgates. Morshead wasted no time celebrating. On June 10th, 1945, just 3 weeks after Tarakan fell, the largest invasion force Australia had ever assembled appeared off Brunei Bay. 29,000 soldiers waited in hundreds of ships. The jungle coastline stretched before them, green and silent. Intelligence reports said 8,000 Japanese soldiers defended the area. More importantly, coast watchers reported 3 major prisoner camps within 20 miles of the landing zones. Time was crushing down like a weight. Every day mattered. The naval bombardment started before dawn. The sound rolled across the water like continuous thunder. Shells screamed overhead and exploded in orange flashes along the shore. The jungle itself seemed to shake. Then bombers came, wave after wave, dropping their loads on marked targets. Black smoke rose in columns against the morning sky. At exactly 0700 hours, the first landing craft hit the beaches. This time, the Australians met almost no resistance. Japanese forces had pulled back into the interior, abandoning the coastline rather than dying on the beaches. Within 6 hours, Australian troops controlled a beachhead 5 miles deep. Within 2 days, they had pushed inland to the first oil facilities. The huge storage tanks stood intact, their metal sides gleaming in the tropical sun. Engineers examined the pumping stations and pipelines. Most of the equipment had been sabotaged by retreating Japanese forces, but the damage was minor. Replacement parts could fix it. The production capacity remained. 350,000 barrels per day, now denied to Japan forever. But the oil was never the real prize. On day 3 of the Brunei operation, an Australian patrol, following a Dayak guide's directions, found what they were looking for. The prison camp sat in a clearing carved from dense jungle. Barbed wire surrounded crude barracks made of bamboo and palm leaves. The smell hit the soldiers first, a thick stench of disease and death that made men gag. Then they saw the prisoners. Skeletons wearing skin shuffled toward the fence. Their eyes were huge in faces that had lost all fat. Bones pressed against flesh everywhere. Arms looked like sticks. Legs could barely hold weight. Some men crawled because walking was impossible. These were Australian and British soldiers, Dutch civilians, local people who had helped the Allies. They had been slowly starving for years. The Japanese gave them bowls of rice with worms and made them work until they collapsed. Disease killed dozens every week. Those too sick to work were often shot. When the prisoners realized they were being rescued, sounds came that hardened soldiers would remember forever. Grown men sobbed. Some fell to their knees. Others tried to cheer, but their voices were too weak. One Australian prisoner, a sergeant from Melbourne who had been captured in Singapore 3 years before, weighed 78 pounds. He grabbed the hand of a young Australian private and would not let go. He kept whispering "thank you" over and over until medics gently pulled him away to treat his dysentery and malaria. Over the next week, Australian forces found 6 more camps around Brunei Bay. They liberated 840 prisoners total. Every single one would have been dead within months if rescue had not come. The Japanese had standing orders. When defeat became certain, kill all prisoners, leave no witnesses. but the Australians moved too fast. They reached the camps before execution orders could be carried out. By June 20th, just 10 days after landing, Australian forces controlled all of Brunei Bay. The oil fields were secure. The prisoners were safe. Japanese resistance had collapsed into scattered groups hiding in the jungle. The speed was breathtaking. Military analysts back in Australia could barely believe the reports. This was supposed to take months. Instead, it took days. Yet even as Australian soldiers celebrated, critics sharpened their attacks. Newspaper editors in America barely mentioned the Brunei operation. When they did, they called it a sideshow. The real war was happening elsewhere. American forces were preparing to invade Japan itself. Atomic weapons were nearly ready. Why waste ink on a backwater campaign that changed nothing about the war's outcome? American commanders in the Pacific Theater were more direct in private communications. One general wrote that the Australians were playing at war while the real fighting happens elsewhere. Another suggested that Australia was trying to claim territory for post-war political advantage. The idea that speed and humanitarian goals drove the campaign was dismissed. Even some Australian politicians questioned the cost. 225 dead at Tarakan. Another 150 at Brunei. How many more would die at Balikpapan, the final target? Morshead ignored the criticism. His eyes were fixed on the biggest prize yet. Balikpapan held the largest oil facilities in all of Borneo. More importantly, intelligence suggested that over 1,000 prisoners were held in camps surrounding the city. The Japanese garrison there numbered 6,000 troops in heavily fortified positions. Taking Balikpapan would require everything Australia had left. On July 1st, 1945, 33,000 Australian troops hit the beaches at Balikpapan in the largest amphibious operation in their nation's history. The naval bombardment that preceded the landing was like nothing the Pacific had ever seen. For 3 days, battleships and cruisers pounded Japanese positions. Over 38,000 shells fell on a strip of coast just 5 miles long. The noise was beyond description, a roar that never stopped. When it finally ended, when the guns fell silent, smoke covered everything. The jungle was torn apart, trees reduced to splinters, bunkers crushed into rubble. The landing itself was almost anticlimactic. Japanese defenders were stunned, half deaf from the bombardment. Many surrendered immediately. Others fled into the interior. By nightfall on day 1, Australian forces held positions that plans said would take a week to reach. The oil spot strategy worked again, even faster than before. Within 5 days, the city was secure. Within 2 weeks, organised Japanese resistance had ended completely. The final statistics told a story that should have made headlines around the world. Across all 3 operations, Tarakan, Brunei, and Balikpapan, Australian forces suffered 2,100 casualties, including 700 killed. Japanese forces lost over 18,000 dead. The Australians liberated 2,700 prisoners from camps throughout Borneo. They secured oil production facilities that had powered Japan's war machine. They accomplished in weeks what conventional planning said would take over a year. But perhaps the most telling number was one that could only be estimated. Intelligence officers calculated that without Australian intervention, 95% of prisoners in Borneo camps would have died before Japan's surrender. That meant roughly 2,500 people owed their lives directly to Morshead's gamble. 2,500 men and women who would have been executed or left to die of disease and starvation. Yet when newspapers reported on the war in July 1945, Borneo barely rated a mention. All eyes were on the approaching invasion of Japan. All minds were focused on the atomic bombs being prepared. The campaign that saved thousands became the campaign that history forgot. Australian soldiers, reading papers from home, started using a bitter phrase. They called Borneo the war the world forgot. the victory nobody wanted to see. On August 6, 1945, just 5 weeks after Australian forces secured Balikpapan, an atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war was over. Around the world, people danced in the streets. Sailors kissed nurses in famous photographs. Church bells rang. Champagne flowed. The nightmare had ended. In Borneo, Australian soldiers received the news with mixed feelings. Relief, certainly. Joy that they would go home alive. But also something bitter and hard to name. Within hours, military analysts in Washington and London began writing their reports. They studied the final months of the Pacific War. They calculated costs and benefits. They drew conclusions. And in many of those official analyses, a single phrase appeared again and again. The Borneo Campaign had been unnecessary. The logic seemed ironclad. Japan was already beaten before the first Australian soldier landed at Tarakan. The atomic bombs would have forced surrender regardless. The oil fields no longer mattered because Japan had no ships left to carry oil anyway. The campaign cost 700 Australian lives for objectives that time would have delivered for free. One American general wrote in his memoir that Borneo was a waste of fine troops on meaningless objectives. The word unnecessary appeared in official histories. It showed up in newspaper articles. It became the accepted truth. General Leslie Morshead read these assessments in silence. He never publicly defended the campaign. He never argued with the critics or tried to change the historical narrative. His style was never about glory or recognition. After the war ended, he returned to civilian life. He went back to his work, his family, his quiet routines. When journalists asked about Borneo, he gave brief answers and changed the subject. When military historians sought interviews, he politely declined. The man who held Tobruk and liberated Borneo simply faded from the spotlight. In 1959, Morshead died of a heart attack. He was 69 years old. His funeral drew military honours and respectful obituaries. Australian newspapers praised his service. But the obituaries focused mainly on Tobruk, the siege that made him famous. Borneo rated only a paragraph or two, usually with that word hanging like a shadow. Unnecessary. The campaign nobody wanted. The victory that came too late. Yet, something unexpected began happening in the years after the war. Military academies around the world started studying the Borneo operations. They analysed Morshead's oil spot strategy with intense interest. The speed of the campaign fascinated military planners. 3 major objectives taken in 10 weeks. Minimal casualties. Maximum impact. The coordination between naval forces, air support, and ground troops was studied as a model of modern warfare. At the United States Naval War College, instructors taught the Brunei Bay landing as an example of perfect amphibious operations. At British staff colleges, the Tarakan assault became required reading for officers learning jungle warfare. The strategy that critics called pointless became standard doctrine. Modern military textbooks describe the oil spot approach as revolutionary. Attack from the sea, secure strong positions, expand rapidly in all directions, cut enemy supply lines, use local intelligence, move faster than the enemy can respond. But the real legacy of Borneo had nothing to do with military tactics. It lived in the 2,700 people who came home when everyone said they should have been left behind. These were the prisoners liberated from camps throughout the island. They returned to Australia, Britain, Netherlands, thin and sick, but alive. They recovered in hospitals. They gained back their weight. They rejoined their families. They lived full lives that Japanese execution squads would have ended in unmarked graves. One of these men was named Thomas Murphy. He had been captured in Singapore in 1942. He spent 3 years in a Borneo camp, watching dysentery and starvation kill his friends one by one. his weight dropped from 160 pounds to 82. He could not walk without help. He accepted that he would die there. When Australian soldiers burst into his camp in June 1945, Murphy did not believe they were real. He thought fever had made him see things. Then a young Australian private put a canteen to his lips. The water was cool and clean. Murphy drank and knew he would live. After the war, Murphy became a teacher. He married and had 4 children. He lived to see his grandchildren born. He died in 2003 at age 87, surrounded by family. His funeral drew over 200 people. At the service, his daughter spoke about the Australian soldiers who came for her father when the world said the mission was pointless. She asked a question that cut to the heart of everything. If saving her father's life was unnecessary, what exactly did necessary mean? That question echoes through the decades. Military historians still debate whether the Borneo Campaign was justified. They weigh Australian casualties against strategic value. They calculate whether the prisoners would have survived until Japan's surrender anyway. They argue about whether humanitarian goals justify military operations. The debate never ends because the question has no perfect answer. But the prisoners who survived and their families know something that statistics cannot capture. They know that Lieutenant James Wilson, 23 years old, from Sydney, died taking a bunker at Balikpapan. They know his death happened just 6 weeks before Japan surrendered. They know that in purely strategic terms, his sacrifice was unnecessary. But they also know that Wilson's death helped liberate a camp where 40 prisoners were days away from execution. Those 40 men lived because Wilson died. They had children who had children. Entire family trees exist because of battles that history calls pointless. Every year on Remembrance Day, ceremonies across Australia honour those who served in Borneo. The crowds are smaller now. Most veterans have passed away, but the ceremonies continue. They keep alive the memory of a campaign that saved thousands while the world looked elsewhere. They remember that sometimes the victories that matter most are not the ones that change the course of history. Sometimes they are simply the ones that bring people home. The Borneo Campaign forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we measure success. We remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki because they ended a war. We remember D-Day because it liberated a continent. We remember MacArthur's return to the Philippines because it fulfilled a dramatic promise. These are the moments that dominate our history books and monuments. They are important and worthy of remembrance. But what about the unglamorous missions? What about the campaigns fought not for glory or strategic advantage, but simply because people were dying and someone had to try saving them? What about the victories that conventional wisdom calls unnecessary? Morshead understood something that his critics missed. Not every battle is about winning the war. Some battles are about proving that certain lives matter enough to fight for, even when fighting makes no strategic sense. The oil fields of Borneo continue pumping oil for peaceful purposes. The jungle has reclaimed the old battlefields. Nature has covered the scars. But in cemeteries across Australia, 700 graves mark where young men are buried. They died in a campaign that many called pointless. Yet because they fought and died, 2,700 people lived. The math is brutal but simple. Was it necessary? History says no. The families of those who came home say yes. Both answers are true. Both answers are incomplete. And in that tension between them lies perhaps the deepest lesson of all. Victory is not always about what we win. Sometimes it is about who we refuse to abandon, even when abandoning them makes perfect strategic sense.